The story of the Judds has always been sold as a country music fairy tale, a mother and daughter stepping out of hardship, climbing onto the biggest stages, and harmonizing their way into history. But behind the bright lights and perfect duets, there was a quieter truth that rarely fit into award show speeches or glossy magazine profiles. Because sometimes the most celebrated voices are the ones carrying the heaviest silence. Wynonna Judd has spent decades living inside that contradiction. To the public, she was the powerhouse, bold, fearless, larger than life. Naomi Judd was the grounding force, the warm presence, the steady smile, the woman who looked like she could hold a family and a career together with pure willpower. Together, they became more than a duo. They became a symbol, a mother-daughter bond that felt almost too perfect to be real. And that's the point. It wasn't perfect. It never was. Their rise in the early 1980s looked fast and effortless from the outside, as if the industry simply discovered them and the rest became destiny. Nashville executives saw the magic in their blend of traditional country emotion and pop-friendly polish. The harmonies were tight, the image was clean, and the story was irresistible. A family act that felt authentic in a genre that rewards authenticity like currency. When a hit started landing, fans didn't just hear songs. They heard a relationship. They heard a home. They heard the kind of love that could survive anything. But even as the records climbed and the applause grew louder, Naomi was fighting a battle most people couldn't see. The transcript frames her health struggle as a looming shadow over their success. And whether the public understood every detail at the time or not, the reality is that illness changes everything, especially when your career depends on stamina, travel, performance schedules, and the pressure to show up smiling. The irony of fame is that it demands the one thing illness steals first: consistency. That's where the truth starts to sharpen. Because the Judds weren't only trying to maintain chart momentum, they were trying to maintain an illusion that the machine could keep running, that the family could keep smiling, that the bond could stay strong under a spotlight that never turns off. When your brand is your relationship, every strain becomes public risk. Every argument becomes a headline waiting to happen. Every exhausted moment becomes a threat to the story people paid to believe. And it wasn't only physical. The script hints early that the pressures of success didn't just attack Naomi's body. They attacked the emotional foundation beneath the duo. Fame has a way of magnifying existing cracks. A controlling habit becomes management. A desperate need for stability becomes tight leadership. A daughter's desire to grow becomes rebellion. None of it happens in one dramatic blow. It happens slowly, in small compromises that pile up until the weight becomes impossible to ignore. So when people ask what happened to the Judds, it's tempting to give the clean answer. Health issues, time, the end of an era. But Wynonna's truth, what keeps surfacing when she looks back, is that their ending wasn't just an ending. It was the cost of carrying a legend while trying to survive the reality underneath it. As the momentum of the Judds accelerated, the line between survival and success began to blur. What audiences saw as a golden era was, behind the scenes, a period of constant negotiation between health and obligation, between family and fame, between what was possible and what was expected. For Naomi and Wynonna, success did not arrive as a reward. It arrived as a responsibility. By the mid-1980s, the duo was everywhere. Chart-topping singles, sold-out tours, industry accolades. Each milestone reinforced the idea that stopping was not an option. In country music, momentum is sacred. Once you have it, you are expected to protect it at all costs. And for the Judds, stopping didn't just mean stepping away from a career. It meant risking the collapse of an entire identity built around resilience, motherhood, and shared strength. Naomi Judd carried that weight more heavily than most. Long before the public fully understood her diagnosis, she was already navigating the reality of a body that could no longer keep pace with the demands placed on it. Touring is unforgiving even for artists in perfect health. For someone battling a chronic illness, it becomes a test of endurance that never truly ends. Fatigue isn't just physical. It erodes patience, clarity, and emotional balance. And yet, night after night, Naomi walked on stage and delivered warmth, harmony, and reassurance to millions who never knew the price she was paying. Wynonna, meanwhile, was changing in ways that success itself accelerated. Her voice, big, emotional, unmistakable, was evolving faster than the duo's image allowed. As her confidence grew, so did her awareness that she was no longer just half of a pair. She was an artist capable of standing alone. But independence inside a mother-daughter partnership is complicated. Growth can feel like betrayal. Ambition can feel like abandonment. And when the partnership is also your family, every professional disagreement cuts deeper. The pressure intensified because their relationship was never allowed to be private. Fans, executives, and media outlets didn't just consume the music, they consumed the bond. Naomi wasn't only a performer. She was seen as the protector, the architect, the emotional anchor. Wynonna wasn't only a daughter. She was the future, the raw talent, the reason the machine kept moving forward. That imbalance, subtle at first, became harder to ignore as the years passed. Health issues turned personal decisions into public crises. When Naomi's condition worsened, there was no graceful way to slow down. Every canceled show raised questions. Every pause sparked rumors. The industry that had elevated them now demanded clarity. Would the Judds continue, or would they stop? And stopping, in the logic of fame, is often framed as failure, even when it's the only humane choice left. By the time the duo announced their disbandment in 1991, the decision felt sudden to fans but inevitable to those inside the storm. It wasn't just about illness anymore. It was about exhaustion, emotional, physical, and relational. The farewell tour became a contradiction in itself, a celebration of success wrapped around the acknowledgement that the partnership could no longer survive as it was. For Wynonna, that ending carried its own trauma. The stage that had once felt shared now loomed as a solo responsibility. She was stepping into independence not through choice, but necessity. And while the public framed her next chapter as liberation, the reality was far more complex. Leaving the Judds meant leaving a version of herself that had been defined since youth. It meant confronting who she was without her mother beside her, harmonizing through both music and life. For Naomi, the ending forced a reckoning she could no longer postpone. The performance adrenaline faded, leaving space for pain that had long been deferred. Illness doesn't negotiate. When the noise stops, what remains is truth. And for Naomi, that truth included not just physical suffering, but emotional vulnerability she had hidden for decades. This is where the story of the Judds shifts from biography to warning. Their success was real. Their love was real. But so was the damage caused by relentless expectation. The disbandment wasn't a collapse. It was a boundary finally drawn after years of crossing lines no one should have to cross. And yet, even in separation, the bond did not dissolve. It transformed. What had once been a shared stage became a shared history, one marked by triumph, sacrifice, and wounds that never fully healed. The end of the Judds was not the end of their story. It was the moment the cost of everything they had built finally came due. After the breakup of the Judds, silence became louder than applause ever had been. The machinery of fame slowed, but the emotional consequences accelerated. What had once been buffered by schedules, rehearsals, and shared purpose now surfaced in full view. For both Naomi and Wynonna, the end of the duo did not bring relief. It brought exposure to grief, to identity confusion, and a long-suppressed psychological pain that had been masked by constant motion. For Naomi, stepping away from the stage meant confronting a body and mind that had been running on borrowed strength. During the height of the Judds' success, illness was something she managed in fragments, between tours, interviews, and obligations. Once the performances stopped, there was no longer anywhere to hide from the physical toll of hepatitis C or the emotional weight it carried. Treatment was harsh, unpredictable, and isolating. Fatigue became a daily reality. Depression, long present but carefully concealed, deepened without the distraction of work. Naomi later spoke openly about how devastating that period was. Fame had given her a voice, but it had also demanded silence about the things that mattered most. She had been praised for strength while quietly unraveling. The contrast between public admiration and private suffering created a psychological fracture that widened over time. Without the structure of the Judds, she was forced to reckon with the truth she had postponed for years. Success does not heal trauma. It often amplifies it. Mental health, once treated as an inconvenient footnote in celebrity narratives, became central to Naomi's life. She described depression not as sadness, but as paralysis, a darkness that stripped away function and hope. The irony was painful. She had spent her career singing about connection, faith, and emotional bridges, yet found herself isolated by an illness few people truly understood. Advocacy became her way forward. Speaking about depression was not just an act of courage, it was an act of survival. By naming the struggle, she reclaimed a sense of control over it. Wynonna's post-Judd's journey followed a different, but equally turbulent path. From the outside, her transition into a solo career looked triumphant. Her voice was still commanding. The accolades continued, but independence came with a psychological cost that few acknowledged. For the first time, she was carrying the weight of expectation alone. There was no shared spotlight, no maternal presence to absorb pressure or share blame. Every success and failure now belonged solely to her. That shift triggered unresolved emotional patterns rooted in childhood. Wynonna had grown up in instability, financial insecurity, emotional unpredictability, and a parent battling mental illness. Fame did not erase those early imprints. It intensified them. The demand to be perfect, powerful, and unwavering mirrored the emotional role she had long played within her family. The strong one, the anchor, the one who keeps moving no matter what. As her solo career progressed, the cracks became harder to conceal. Wynonna struggled with anxiety, depression, and self-worth, even as her public image projected confidence. The disconnect between who she appeared to be and how she felt internally created a cycle of isolation. Admitting vulnerability felt dangerous in an industry that equates weakness with irrelevance. For years, she carried the burden quietly, convinced that strength meant endurance rather than honesty. The mother-daughter relationship, no longer reinforced by daily collaboration, entered a new and fragile phase. Distance created space for reflection, but also resentment. Wynonna has spoken about the complicated emotions surrounding Naomi's decision to retire, understanding it intellectually, yet feeling emotionally abandoned by it. Naomi, in turn, wrestled with guilt, knowing her health had altered her daughter's path in ways she could not undo. Reunions over the years were not simple celebrations. They were negotiations with history. Each performance carried layers of memory, joy, pain, pride, regret. When Naomi and Wynonna stepped back on stage together, audiences saw harmony. What they didn't see was the emotional labor required to stand side by side again after years of unresolved hurt. These moments were not about rekindling the past. They were about closure, about honoring what had been without pretending it could exist unchanged. Mental health remained the thread connecting every chapter of their story. Naomi's openness helped shift public conversation, but it did not erase the depth of her suffering. Wynonna's later willingness to speak about her own struggles signaled a generational shift, one that challenged the myth that talent and success insulate people from psychological pain. In reality, they often magnify it. What makes the story of the Judds endure is not simply their music, but the honesty that emerged after the spotlight dimmed. Their legacy is not just built on chart positions or awards, but on the uncomfortable truth that love and achievement do not cancel out suffering. Sometimes they coexist uneasily, bound together by expectation and fear. In hindsight, the end of the Judds was not a failure of ambition or devotion. It was a collision between human limits and an industry that rarely acknowledges them. Naomi and Wynonna did not walk away because they stopped caring. They stepped back because continuing would have meant erasing themselves entirely. This is the truth that slowly surfaced as the years passed. The duo's greatest strength, their bond, was also the source of their deepest wounds. And survival required redefining that bond outside the glare of fame. The music remains timeless. The harmony still resonates. But behind it lies a story far more complex than nostalgia allows. A story about endurance, vulnerability, and a long, unfinished work of healing. By the time the story of the Judds entered its later chapters, the public narrative had shifted. What was once framed as a tragic but dignified ending gradually transformed into something more complicated. A long aftermath shaped by memory, grief, and unfinished emotional business. Time did not soften everything. Instead, it clarified what had been postponed for years, especially the emotional cost that neither fame nor distance could erase. For Naomi, life after the spotlight was defined by contradiction. On one hand, she had escaped the relentless pace that her body could no longer endure. On the other, she had lost the structure that once gave her purpose and distraction. Chronic illness does not end when the schedule clears. It becomes more visible. Without the rhythm of touring and performing, Naomi was left alone with pain that no longer had anywhere to go. Physical suffering merged with psychological strain, creating cycles that were difficult to break. Her advocacy work emerged from that vulnerability. Speaking openly about depression was not a branding decision. It was an act of necessity. Naomi challenged the illusion that strength meant silence. She described mental illness in language that stripped away romance and metaphor, insisting that it was not weakness, but disease. For many fans, this honesty was shocking. For others, it was life-saving. Yet even as she became a voice for awareness, the struggle itself did not disappear. Awareness does not equal cure. It simply creates space to breathe. Wynonna, meanwhile, was navigating her own reckoning. Success as a solo artist did not resolve the emotional patterns shaped by years inside the duo. Independence brought autonomy, but also isolation. Without the shared identity of the Judds, she was forced to confront who she was beyond the narrative she had lived inside since adolescence. That process was neither linear nor gentle. Her personal life became a mirror of internal conflict. Relationships were strained. Public scrutiny intensified every misstep. The same media that once celebrated her strength now dissected her vulnerability. In many ways, Wynonna became what she had always feared, alone under a microscope, expected to be resilient without showing the cost of that resilience. The pressure to perform strength, emotionally and professionally, began to crack. The mother-daughter relationship evolved in parallel, but not always in harmony. Distance did not erase dependency, it reshaped it. Naomi and Wynonna were no longer partners on stage, yet they remained bound by the shared history, shared trauma, and shared public perception. Every reunion carried expectations that neither could fully satisfy. Audiences wanted closure. They wanted redemption. They wanted the story to resolve cleanly. But real relationships rarely do. Behind the scenes, reconciliation was ongoing, imperfect, and deeply human. There were moments of closeness and moments of withdrawal. Conversations that healed some wounds reopened others. Fame had frozen parts of their relationship in time, and moving forward required dismantling roles they had played for decades. Naomi was no longer just the guiding force. Wynonna was no longer just a daughter. Redefining those identities took patience neither of them always had. Reunion performances, when they happened, were emotionally loaded events. They were not about reclaiming glory, but about honoring endurance. Each appearance felt less like a comeback and more like a farewell layered with gratitude and grief. Standing together again meant acknowledging everything that had been lost, not pretending it could be restored. For fans, these moments were nostalgic. For Naomi and Wynonna, they were acts of emotional courage. As years passed, the theme that kept resurfacing was mental health, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality that shaped every decision. Naomi's depression, long discussed, became a central lens through which her entire life was re-examined. Wynonna's openness about her own struggles reframed her public image from untouchable powerhouse to complex survivor. Their stories began to resonate beyond country music, reaching anyone who understood what it meant to function publicly while falling apart privately. What makes this phase of the Judds' story so difficult and so compelling is that it refuses easy conclusions. There is no moment where everything resolves, no clean moral lesson. Love did not fix illness. Success did not protect mental health. Distance did not erase pain. And yet, within that reality, there was still connection, still effort, still an unwillingness to abandon one another completely. The legacy of the Judds, viewed through this lens, becomes less about perfection and more about persistence. They endured not because they were unbreakable, but because they kept returning to each other, even when it hurt. The music, once a shared shield, became a shared memory, a reminder of what they had built and what it had cost. By this stage of the story, the truth, Wynonna would later reflect on, was no longer about why the duo ended. That question had been answered many times. The deeper truth was about what remained afterward. The lifelong work of managing illness, repairing relationships, and redefining self-worth outside of applause. The Judds did not disappear when the duo ended. They transformed into something quieter, more fragile, and more honest. And in that transformation lies the most human part of their story, a reminder that endings do not conclude pain, but they can create space for understanding. By the time Wynonna began speaking more openly about the past, the story of the Judds had taken on a new tone, less myth, more reckoning. Distance gave her perspective, but it also stripped away the protective layers that once softened memory. What remained was not bitterness, but clarity. The truth she would eventually acknowledge was not a single revelation, but an accumulation of realizations that arrived slowly, often painfully, over time. One of the hardest truths was that love and harm can coexist. The Judds were built on devotion, sacrifice, and shared survival. Yet those same qualities sometimes trapped both women in roles they did not consciously choose. Naomi's fierce protectiveness, shaped by hardship and fear of loss, often crossed into control. Wynonna's hunger for independence, shaped by talent and ambition, sometimes collided with guilt and obligation. Neither dynamic was born from malice. Both were born from unresolved trauma layered beneath success. For years, Wynonna carried the weight of being the strong one. On stage, strength was applauded. Off stage, it became an expectation she could never escape. Vulnerability felt dangerous, not only personally, but professionally. Admitting pain risked dismantling the image that had sustained her career. So she learned to perform resilience as convincingly as she performed music. The cost of that performance, however, was emotional isolation. As time passed, the consequences surfaced in ways that could no longer be ignored. Anxiety, depression, and self-doubt seeped into spaces she once controlled. Personal relationships became strained under the pressure of unprocessed grief and inherited patterns of coping. Fame, once a source of validation, began to feel like surveillance. Every struggle was magnified, every misstep interpreted as evidence of weakness rather than humanity. The relationship with Naomi remained central to this internal conflict. Even after the duo ended, the emotional partnership did not dissolve. Wynonna often found herself measuring her own choices against her mother's expectations, spoken or implied. At the same time, she wrestled with resentment for sacrifices she never consciously agreed to make. Loving someone deeply does not erase the need for boundaries, and learning where to draw those lines came late and imperfectly. Naomi, too, lived with regret. She understood that illness had forced decisions that altered her daughter's life in irreversible ways. Guilt became another layer of her depression, an invisible burden she carried while advocating for mental health awareness. Helping others brought meaning, but it did not absolve her of the belief that she had failed in some essential way as both a mother and a partner. When Wynonna reflects on the legacy of the Judds, what emerges is not nostalgia, but accountability. She acknowledges that success demanded silence about pain, and that silence became generational. Patterns of emotional suppression, learned early, repeated themselves under different circumstances. Breaking those patterns required confronting not just the past, but the internal narratives that had shaped her identity for decades. Therapy, self-reflection, and time slowly altered her relationship with vulnerability. Speaking openly about mental health became less about advocacy and more about honesty. Wynonna stopped framing resilience as endurance and began redefining it as adaptability. The willingness to ask for help, to slow down, to admit uncertainty. This shift did not erase her struggles, but it changed how she lived with them. Public perception also began to evolve. Fans who once idolized perfection started to recognize complexity. The story of the Judds transformed from a cautionary tale about fame into a broader conversation about mental health, family systems, and the cost of unresolved trauma. Their music gained new resonance, not as background nostalgia, but as emotional testimony shaped by lived experience. The most difficult truth Wynonna came to accept was that closure is not an event. It is a process. There is no single conversation, performance, or farewell that could resolve decades of shared history. Healing required ongoing effort, often without guarantees of comfort or clarity. Some wounds softened, others remained sensitive. Learning to live with that reality became part of her maturity. In this later chapter, Wynonna no longer seeks to explain the Judds as a tragedy or a triumph. She understands it as a complex human story, one shaped by love, illness, ambition, fear, and endurance. The music remains a powerful artifact, but it no longer defines her entirely. She has allowed herself to exist beyond the harmonies, beyond the expectations, beyond the legacy that once felt inescapable. What she finally reveals is not scandal or hidden betrayal. It is something quieter and more unsettling. That survival sometimes requires letting go of narratives that once kept you alive. The Judds were real. The bond was real. The pain was real. And acknowledging all of it, without rewriting or romanticizing the past, became the most honest act of freedom she could claim. This, ultimately, is the truth Wynonna carries forward. That healing is not about preserving legends, but about reclaiming humanity after the legend fades. As the years moved forward, the story of the Judds settled into something quieter, but no less powerful. What once dominated headlines and award stages gradually transformed into reflection, both personal and collective. For Wynonna, this phase was not about revisiting the past for validation, but about understanding how that past continued to shape her present. Time did not erase the weight of what she and her mother shared. It clarified it. One of the most important realizations Wynonna reached was that healing does not mean separation from pain. It means learning how to live alongside it without letting it dictate every decision. For much of her life, pain had been something to overcome publicly while suppressing privately. That strategy had worked for survival, but not for peace. Accepting that distinction marked a turning point in how she approached both her career and her inner life. The legacy of the Judds began to feel less like a burden and more like a foundation, solid but no longer restrictive. Wynonna allowed herself to reinterpret the music through the lens of experience rather than obligation. Songs that once felt like performances became reminders of endurance. Lyrics about love, bridges, and faith carried deeper meaning when heard through the realities of illness, loss, and emotional struggle. The music remained powerful, but its role in her life evolved. Public conversations around mental health also changed during this time, creating space for greater honesty. What had once been whispered or avoided became more openly discussed. Wynonna's willingness to share her own struggles resonated with audiences who recognized themselves in her vulnerability. She no longer felt compelled to uphold an image of invincibility. Instead, she modeled something more sustainable: authenticity. The mother-daughter bond, though altered by time and circumstance, remained present in quieter ways. Naomi's influence did not disappear with distance or loss. It lived on through memory, through music, and through the lessons, both positive and painful, that Wynonna carried forward. Grief became less sharp, but more complex. It was no longer only about absence, but about integration, finding a way to hold love and loss simultaneously. Wynonna's resilience in this period was not loud or dramatic. It showed itself in small, consistent choices, seeking support, setting boundaries, redefining success. The drive to constantly prove worth faded, replaced by a desire for balance. She continued to perform and create, but on terms that prioritized well-being over validation. The stage became a place of expression rather than escape. Looking back, Wynonna no longer frames the end of the Judds as something that happened to her. She sees it as part of a larger arc, one shaped by forces both within and beyond her control. Illness, fame, family, and fear intersected in ways no one could fully manage. Accepting that complexity allowed her to release blame, including blame directed inward. The story of the Judds, in its final form, resists simplification. It is not a cautionary tale meant to warn others away from ambition, nor is it a sentimental tribute that ignores cost. It is a human story, messy, unresolved, and deeply relatable. That is why it continues to resonate long after the music stopped topping charts. As Wynonna reflects on her journey, the truth she shares is not designed to shock. It is designed to be understood. The legacy she now honors is not perfection, but honesty. Not endurance at all costs, but compassion for herself, for her mother, and for anyone navigating life under pressure. In the end, what remains is not just a catalog of songs or a chapter in country music history. What remains is a reminder that behind every harmony is a human story, and that survival, when paired with self-awareness, can become a form of quiet triumph. In the final reflection, the story of the Judds no longer belongs only to history or to the charts where their songs once lived. It belongs to a deeper understanding of what it means to survive fame without losing one's humanity. For Wynonna, reaching this point was not about arriving at peace, but about learning how to live honestly with what remains. Time has softened some memories and sharpened others. The music still carries warmth, harmony, and emotional truth, but it now exists alongside a fuller awareness of the cost it demanded. Wynonna does not look back through the lens of regret or nostalgia alone. She looks back with acceptance, recognizing that love and pain were always intertwined in her story with Naomi. The bond between mother and daughter was never simple. It was forged through shared hardship, ambition, sacrifice, and fear of loss. That bond produced extraordinary art, but it also created emotional expectations neither woman fully understood at the time. Wynonna now sees that their success required silence about struggles that eventually demanded a voice. Speaking that truth is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of respect for what they endured. The legacy of the Judds, when stripped of myth, becomes more meaningful, not less. Their songs resonate because they were born from real emotion, not perfection. The harmonies endure because they carried both strength and vulnerability. What listeners hear today is not just nostalgia, but evidence of resilience shaped by lived experience. For Wynonna, the truth she finally embraces is simple and difficult at the same time. Survival does not require erasing the past. It requires understanding it. Healing does not mean rewriting history into something easier to remember. It means allowing complexity to exist without shame. That perspective has given her a freedom she never had at the height of fame, the freedom to be human without apology. As the chapter of the Judds closes in memory, What remains is not an ending, but a continuation. The music still speaks. The lessons still matter. And the story, told honestly, becomes larger than any stage it once occupied. It becomes a reminder that behind every celebrated harmony is a human cost, and that acknowledging that cost can be the most powerful legacy of all.